Well, hopefully everybody's still awake after eating a big lunch. Hopefully I'll be able to be as entertaining as our previous speakers and maybe even keep us on time. So the previous speakers this afternoon have mainly focused on recycled materials, sustainable packaging, issues that might come up from the use of recycled materials. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about here. Two case studies as far as how recycled materials have maybe caused unforeseen problems or had the potential to cause unforeseen problems in food packaging. I'm going to talk about surrogate versus batch testing very briefly, since my colleague Dr. Plaza has already touched on that some. And then we'll talk about the two case studies of Di-isopropylnapthalene in paper, as well as long-chain perfluorinated alkyl substances. So surrogate testing versus batch testing. A lot of times when companies are utilizing recycled material, or they want to use a recycled material in food, whether or not it's for food contact or for other uses, in order to verify that their process cleans up the material to an acceptable amount, they'd often prefer to do batch testing. And it's understandable. I mean, if you're doing batch testing, you can basically continue to use the product that's coming out of your recycling process, because it is your normal result. And you have some control most of the time over that feedstock. But for recycled processes that don't have control over their feedstock, specifically for recycled processes that might use feedstock that are not limited to previously food grade packaging materials, FDA recommends that recycling manufacturers utilize surrogate testing. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but the main reason is that batch testing of recycled materials is dependent upon the quality of the specific feedstock that's tested. It's not going to be representative of the general efficacy of a recycling process regardless of feedstock, and if the feedstock changes, there is a chance that the resulting product that comes out of that process is not going to be as clean as what you might think based upon your batch testing. So basically, surrogate testing involves spiking virgin material in order to determine the general efficacy of a recycling process regardless of feedstock. And for our recycling guidance for plastics, and we have in the past actually recommended representative compounds for different classes of chemicals that are expected in paper, as well as just not only plastic, that companies can use in order to determine if their recycling process would be suitable for feedstock that is not limited purely to food grade material. We're now going to talk about some case studies where surrogate testing might have addressed the issue as opposed to batch testing, which at least for the first case definitely did not catch the issue. So this deals with di-isopropylnapthalene that was found in imported apples from New Zealand, and this occurred around the 2006-2007 time frame. At that time frame, New Zealand was the world's, I believe, second largest producer of apples. It was second only to Washington State at that point. So you can imagine that New Zealand wouldn't be very happy if all of a sudden the U.S. stopped imports of New Zealand apples, especially since due to the changes in seasons, the difference in seasons between the northern and southern hemisphere, especially at that point in time, most of the off-season apples that you would see in the grocery store were imported from New Zealand. Back in 2006, 2007, FDA issued an import alert for apples due to the fact that customs had been finding di-isopropylnapthalene in apples imported from New Zealand. And what an import alert does is it basically stops all shipment of that particular product from that particular country. Now, the issue with DIPN is that it is regulated as a pesticide for use in potatoes for sprout inhibition. So when Customs detected DIPN in the apples, the immediate thought was, oh, this is an unregulated pesticide use. EPA doesn't look very kindly on that. We better shut down the import of DIPN. The problem with that assumption is, if you look at what it's used for, it's for sprout inhibition in potatoes. There's not really any reason to use DIPN on apples. It's not going to perform that technical effect. It's not really useful as a pesticide for potatoes. So then the big question became, where did the DIPN come from? You know, these were not processed apples other than the fact that they were washed. There shouldn't be any food additives attached to these. Where did it come from? And as Stephen mentioned in his previous talk, DIPN is a contaminant that's often found in recycled paper. Specifically, DIPN is used as a constituent in carbonless copy paper. It's an organic solvent for microencapsulation of dyes that are used for pigments, printing on paper, things of that nature. And what was eventually determined, what was happening is that DIPN was present in the recycled paper containers that were being used to ship the apples from New Zealand. So in fact, there was no agricultural use of the DIPN. This was simply a standpoint of contamination exacerbated by the fact that the apples were stored in those recycled paper containers for so long during shipment from New Zealand to the U.S. So the trays tested positive for DIPN, which demonstrates the limitation of batch testing for contaminants, because if we look at the resolution of the issue, basically New Zealand's tray manufacturers had to implement a feedstock management plan to exclude carbonless copy paper. Meanwhile, if they had been using recycled processes that had been tested with surrogate batch testing, they would know if their recycled processes would clean the DIPN or not, and they could use those even carbonless copy paper in the recycled paper processes that might clean that out. But once they implemented a feedstock control, the import alert was lifted on the New Zealand apples, and all of us happy Americans were able to have apples in the middle of winter and early spring when they wouldn't normally be available in the U.S. So one of the questions that we always get is, what is the applicability of this to the recycled paper supply in the United States? Well, in the U.S., carbonless copy paper, while it is not used anywhere near as widely as it is in other countries, or for example, as New Zealand. This hasn't always been the case. I remember when I was little, every time you did a credit card transaction, there was carbonless copy paper. Well, obviously, when's the last time you did that for a credit card transaction in the U.S.? You haven't. The thing is, at that time, they were still using carbonless copy paper for credit card transactions in New Zealand. So technology is a wonderful thing. That brings us to the second case study, which is long-chain perfluorinated alkyl substances in paper. So long-chain perfluorinated alkyl substances, abbreviated as PFASs. We'll do a little chemistry. I promise I won't talk too much. I used to be a chemist in a former life. Now I'm just a bureaucrat. But basically, these are substances with an extended alkyl chain that's longer than 8 carbon atoms long, where all of the hydrogens have been replaced with fluorine. So the structure that we have here on this slide is probably the poster boy for perfluoroalkyl substances. That is perfluorooctanoic acid. So anybody who's familiar with PFASs are familiar with perfluorooctanoic acid. One of the important things to know about perfluorinated substances is they're completely man-made. They do not naturally occur, but even though they don't naturally occur, they are ubiquitous throughout the environment, and that is purely due to environmental contamination from industrial processes with perfluoroalkylated substances. They are so ubiquitous in the environment that they're actually in the blood supply of every single human. So all of us have some level of perfluoroalkylated substances in our blood, and due to that fact, even though those levels are very, very low, that resulted in quite a lot of publicity around perfluoroalkylated substances. That's not to say that PFASs are not without toxicological significance, but we'll get to that in a second. From a food packaging standpoint, one of the interesting things about perfluoroalkylated substances are they are both hydrophobic and oligophobic, which means that if you use them on, for example, paper packaging for food, they will not only import to the paper grease resistance, but they'll also incorporate water resistance as well, which is a pretty unique property from a chemistry standpoint. And it's also important to note that due to these unique properties, historically, long-chain perfluorinated alkyl substances have been used in a very wide variety of applications, of which food packaging is a very, very limited standpoint. Everybody's familiar with Scotchgard. That's a perfluoroalkylated substance that at one point in time everybody sprayed on all their couches, was used on all textiles. It's used for waterproofing of waterproof jackets. It's used in industrial applications, etc. But for food packaging, the interesting application of that is as a coating on paper packaging. And from a technology standpoint, it's actually quite ingenious. The long-chain perfluorinated alkyl substance is normally formed as an acid and converted into an alcohol so that it can then be incorporated as a side chain off of a polymeric backbone. What the polymeric backbone allows is for the substance to be coated on a paper substrate. So the polymeric backbone forms the interface between the paper substrate that sticks the perfluorinated alkyl substance chains to the paper, makes them substantive to the paper, but at the same time you have all these perfluorinated chains sticking off the paper, giving you the hydrophobic and oligophobic properties. So it's very useful technology. The problem is there are safety concerns with perfluoroalkylated substances, which didn't really come into light until these substances were widely used in paper manufacturing or in industrial processes as well. So long-chain perfluorinated alkyl substances can break down or have residual impurities of the long-chain perfluoroalkyl acids or alcohols. And those acids and alcohols have been shown to be reproductive and developmental toxins, which in and of itself is not a good thing, but depending upon exposure, we can often deal with those issues if exposure is kept to a minimum. And we have a risk assessment paradigm that's set up in order to allow us to handle risk assessment properties of these types of materials. Or I should say these types of toxicants. The added issue with long-chain perfluorinated alkyl substances is that they're also biopersistent. So what that means is the exposure that your body sees over time, your systematic body burden, is not the same as your dietary exposure. Normally, for risk assessment purposes, we would see what the dietary exposure is and do toxicity testing to support that exposure. But for a biopersistent material, what it basically means is over time, your exposure, your systematic body burden, continually gets higher than what your dietary concentration is. Your dietary concentration is just a baseline of your exposure for that day, but since it builds up in the body, your overall systematic body burden over time continues to go up and up and up until you reach a plateau point. So it's not something that can easily be handled by our normal risk assessment paradigms. And due to that nature, basically FDA requires chronic toxicity studies for biopersistent compounds. But at the time that the biopersistence issue was determined, there are already a significant number of regulated compounds for that use. It was the subject of several listings in our regulations. 21 CFR 176-170 is our paper regulation. There were several listings for perfluorinated alkyl substances in that. These listings were very old, as Dr. Begley pointed out earlier, some of them from the late 1960s, early 1970s. There are also several food contact notifications for these long-chain perfluorinated alkyl substances. So at this point, it's a matter of, well, do you perform the chronic toxicity studies, or do you no longer use the substances? And in conversation with industry, we reached a voluntary agreement with manufacturers to no longer sell the product. That occurred in 2001. And actually earlier this year, FDA published a final rule removing listings for 3 specific perfluorinated alkyl substances in paper that were listed in 176-170, and we've also published a final notice removing the listing for the remaining long-chain perfluorinated alkyl substances from 21 CFR based upon abandonment. And that's actually something worth pointing out. Even by 2011, most manufacturers of paper and even manufacturers of perfluorinated substances in general had moved away from long-chain substances because of public pressure, and also due to work with EPA on a product stewardship initiative. So due to that product stewardship initiative, there's actually very limited manufacture of perfluorinated alkyl substances in the U.S.
I also had a quick question. Would this come under your purview, Teflon in frying pans?
Right, so Teflon in frying pans, we'll say, rather than using the trade name, Teflon is polytetrafluoroethylene. Excuse me. Like I said, I used to be a chemist. So there you have the difference that PTFE does not have long perfluorinated alkyl chains. And the fact that it is a polymer. So, for example, everyone raised the issue of, oh, PFOA is used to make, at one point in time was used to make polytetrafluoroethylene. But as Dr. Begley mentioned in his talk earlier today, due to the sintering process for nonstick pans, which is what most people think of when they think of food contact uses of PTFE, all the PFOA is driven off. And we've also noticed that unless you extremely, unless you extremely thermally abuse the pan, no new low molecular weight perfluorinated alkyl substances are formed. So for PTFE, there's no issues with reproductive developmental toxicity or biopersistence.